Learning from the biology of evolution, exaptation as a design strategy for future cities. The main problem we are facing today is climate crisis, sea level rising, and we also know that the expansion of urban areas diminishing cultivable land. But what are the causes of this environmental crisis? This is how the world will look like if we don't halt CO2 emissions by 2050. More than 240 million people worldwide are international migrants. Refugees account for fewer than 10% of the total. And in theory, they are the least contentious group, because many countries have signed international commitments to admit them. The rest are moving to work. This phenomenon has a serious impact in our cities and society. In the next few decades, we will likely to see other pandemics. We can predict with reasonable confidence because of the recent increased frequency of major epidemics, such as SARS and Ebola, and because of social and environmental changes driven by humans that may have contributed to COVID-19 emergence. The absolute number of people living in slums or informal settlements grew to over 1 billion, with 80% attributed to three regions: Eastern and Southeastern Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Central and Southern Asia. An estimated of 3 billion people will require adequate and affordable housing by 2030. Because of the population is increasing, we need more resources, but there is less soil available. So this is an urban paradox on the impossible run. We know that one of the main drivers to this situation is the way we do architecture, the way we design and build our cities. So the question is, what we can change in architecture? A lot of discussion has been going on, transformation on the architecture that we know as a suitable or resilient architecture, but we are trying to formulate a different question here. What if problems within was an intrinsically problem of what we define architecture today? What if it is possible to find a new definition of architecture that are more intrinsically ecological? The answer to this can come from a very long literature telling us that the majority of architecture that we nominate as architecture is coming from a very selected culture and a specific place in the world. What is the rest of the architecture? The rest of this architecture can be something that has not been categorized properly. The rest of this architecture is what we have seen in biology or of evolutionary studies. We realize that part of the way natural selection was not included in categorization. So according to the literature, we define architecture everything that is built through a functional and deterministic design. This is the informal architecture. We must admit that the majority of the architecture worldwide has not been designed by architects. There are many examples around the world of cultures and places with architecture just done by the common sense and adapting to the environmental conditions in an apparently ecological balance. So what we do? Should we move? Should we freeze? Well, we are on the part that we think we need to move on. How we can do this? In times of crisis, associative thinking plays a key role. In times of global environmental crisis, transdisciplinary knowledge becomes valuable for understanding phenomena in a holistic way. Why is associative thinking important today? According to Pringle, we have a default survival mode, which is the analytical thought, while our crisis survival mode is the associative thinking. We as humans are immersed in the vast socio-ecological system of our planet. In this sense, human action is analogous to that of other actors present in the ecosystem. The only difference is the tools that the human being uses to carry them. According this to a specific of a human is the use of the creativity as a form of manifestation of associative thinking. Associative thinking is creative, visionary, radical, and polygraph. Other actors use other instruments which are also unique. The birth of associative thinking was around 40,000 years before Christ, according to Pringle. In other words, associative thinking is thinking outside the box, which in times of crisis triggers a useful way of how to solve problems. Transdisciplinary research involving the biology of evolution is proving particularly significant, having a great impact in applied research. According to Gould and Birva, exaptation is the possibility that in nature the relationship between organs and functions was potentially redundant, so as to allow that a trait developed for a certain adaptive reasons could be co-opted or converted to a function also completely independent from the previous one. The concept of exaptation is therefore a particularly interesting case study of evolution because it evokes the relationship between structure and functions, between optimization and imperfection in nature, calling into the question the long prevailing adaptationist vision of the 20th century. A good example is the sixth finger of the panda. We humans also have this protuberance in the back of our hand, but we don't use it, while the panda, he uses it continually. While its architectural design as an environmental adaptation mechanism that depends indirectly on natural selection, as many others, is initial focus of the present writing. We agree with Pievani and Sarelli by arguing that hypothesis, the architecture design which attributes to a function to the design structure, is equivalent to adaptation. So what is the architectural design mode equivalent to exaptation called? Gould claims that the exaptation processes a form adaptation, non-adaptation, because it occurs by functional cooptation. First, if a mode of design, non-design, equivalent to adaptation exists, how can architectural adaptation contribute to the evolution of cities and buildings? We need a new taxonomy in architecture. The way we categorize things is a reflection of our thinking. I will quote Foucault when he wrote that in Paris in the 16th century, jobless and loitering people on public spaces were treated as mentally ill people and put it into hospitals with psychiatrists. It is very important how we categorize things because this is how we see our surroundings. The following taxonomy does not intend to be conclusive. Rather, it is a starting point aiming to enhance an aspect of architecture that has always been considered secondary or insignificant. The architectural and archaeological literature illustrating the following case study already exists, and in some cases is even quite extensive. We don't intend to retrace the history of architecture in an orthodox way. Instead, we aim to analyze only a neglected aspect in literature, which is the presence of functional cooptation in the following selected case study. Functionalization of existing geomorphologies. The forms of tectonic symbiosis between geomorphology and design, and therefore the functional cooptation of redundant forms born for other function or for not function, successfully cross every historical epoch and every geographical place on Earth. Chronologically, we can deduce from previous examples that there is a formal prevalence of the informal. Here are three examples from Jordan, United States, and Saudi Arabia. Integration of function in existing structures. Although we have a tendency to describe our architecture as the result of a single intended use, resulting from a deterministic design, which we then break into a series of separate and complementary uses, almost in each tectonic component, there are different functions, some designed deterministically, others co-opted. So much of that, the presence of several functions, decorative, structural, or otherwise, in the same tectonic component is probably an intrinsic feature of architecture. In much cases, specifically, we observe the architecture from the past, from classicism to Romanesque and Gothic. To distinguish the primary function from the secondary one, it is virtually impossible. Refunctionalization of function in existing structures. What is described in the first category does not exclude that there are cases that are also very frequent in the history of architecture in which literally distinct functions follow one another in some tectonic component, as a striking case in the use of pre-existing masonry structures as foundation of successive buildings. In other cases, has this secondary use been foreseen, even if paradoxically it constitutes a topos of architecture, for example, Romanesque on Roman infrastructures. The phenomenon is highly present in historical multi-layer contexts such as the Italian cities, such as the medieval Acropolis of Perugia, for example. This can be also found in other regions in the world, such as Mexico City, which is another great example because the Spanish grid was built on top of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. Integration or change of use. In this category, we intend to include all subsequent and unforeseen uses of a given architecture when required transformation have occurred through a deterministic project. Essentially, it is a change of use not foreseen when the architecture was built and, for this reason, falls in the modality of architectural exaptation. All these modalities, when performed consciously and therefore with deterministic, even if the initial architectural design did not imply them, are alternatively indicated as regeneration, restoration, conservation, preservation, refurbishment, renovation, and functional adaptation, depending on the geographic context, the historical period, the cultural value attributed to the architecture, or the specific architectural discipline. Versailles Palace is a great example of this. Lastly, we have temporary appropriation of the space. The temporary appropriation of the space is an urban phenomenon in which people use public spaces to carry out activities for which initially public spaces were not designed for. We state that the informal behavioral patterns increase the resilience of public spaces because they strengthen the bond between people and these places. Such informal behavioral patterns are categorized in three main groups: commerce and work, leisure, arts or sports, and lastly, worship or sacralization, as we can see from the photos from the left to the right. As mentioned in previous slides, concepts borrowed from biology have been used in the narrative of history of architecture for some time. An initial objective of this presentation was to highlight the relevance of architectural exaptation to the research agenda. We have highlighted that much of architecture in which we live is not the result of a deterministic design process. The underestimation of the undeterministic processes of transformation of architecture and co-opting its parts is a result of a prejudice. Once again, prejudices can be explained and demonstrated thanks to transdisciplinary studies. The greater dignity attribute to design determinism corresponds to the idea that is the result of the creativity as an advanced expression of human intelligence. However, The studies cited by Pringle demonstrate the opposite, as creativity it derives from the indeterminism of associative thinking, as opposed to the linear thinking as a default of survival mode, just as the five categories that we described above. Consequently, Pievani and the genetist Iwan Verny also remind us that in nature all creative systems are indeterministic, in the sense that they provide a redundancy of forms and relationship without a specific use. This indeterminacy is precisely the basis of the adaptive resilience of creative structure, such as the DNA, the human brain, and even the spandrels, like the six fingers of the panda. The bird's feathers and their manifestations, like the primitive drawings. In Woolhouse, Gould also explains that the reading of a trend of progress, in this case concerning deterministic planning, can be the result of a reification, that is, the transformation into reality of an instruction, linked to the perception that man has of himself at the top of an evolutionary scale. This bias is reflected in the taxonomies and in the definition that humanity uses to describe its surroundings. As we previously described, the shift of our attention from the history of civilization towards paleoanthropology and beyond would make it easier to identify the bias in the form of reification of false trends. Conservation, informality, like the work of contemporary practices such urban think tank Teddy Cross, Giancarlo Massati, and Alessandro Aravena, and previously architecture as a process, as expressed by radical movements such as the Japanese Metabolists and the Austrian Radicals, have been overlooked as a possible representation of architecture exaptation. This bias may also be the cause by concern of architects who think that the indeterminism as a non-project may question the existence of the architect itself. In reality, architectural exaptation is, instead, a design which prioritizes redundancy of shape and genotypes on preassigned functions and phenotypes.